to our first guest, Senator Brian Schatz, who's joining us here in studio. But before we do, we always want to remind our viewers watching both on air and online to engage in the conversation. You can add your questions for our guests in the comment section on Facebook.
So join us there live, and joining us now in studio is Senator Brian Schatz, back in the district. So good to see you, sir.
Nice to be home. Nice to see you both.
I want to start. We have so much to cover in our time together, and I want to dive right into the president's proposed tax bill, because, of course, that is the thing that everyone is focused on. It could mean big changes for Hawaii. It could mean big changes for the country. Let's break it down. How are you feeling about it right now?
It's not going to be helpful to the people of Hawaii. It would throw a lot of people off of Medicaid nationally. It's about 14 million people who will lose Medicaid coverage, and it also cuts nutrition assistance, and we estimate we would lose about $300 million worth of food assistance. And you might ask, well, why are they doing this? What are these cuts for? It is not to balance the budget. It is not to invest in other things. It is to finance a tax cut that most people aren't even asking for and would benefit primarily people making more than $4 million a year. So we're trying as hard as we can to work with our Republican colleagues in the Senate to get this thing to be a little less harmful to all of their constituents. But I think in the alternative, and I think that's a really real possibility, we're just going to try to have to kill it. The Affordable Care Act was also almost repealed in the first Trump administration when they had the White House, the Senate, and the House. And famously, John McCain walked onto the Senate floor and gave the thumbs down and killed that legislation. And 22 million people kept their health care. So there are opportunities for bipartisanship, but we think this is going to be a fight, and we think we can win it.
You know, there has been some already pushback, obviously, on this from the Republican side as well. The president having to go to Capitol Hill to lobby his own party to try to get them to see eye to eye on this. In the conversations that you're having with your Republican counterparts, is there daylight? Is there ways that you feel like there could be some persuasion for them not to vote this through?
I think so. If they're listening to their constituents, then they wouldn't have the votes. I think there are a number of members of the Senate who do not want to enact Medicaid cuts, and they understand that all of these new requirements are designed to save money by kicking people off of Medicaid. And so I think the votes are there. The question is, does Donald Trump have the influence with the senators that he does with the House members? With the House members, you can call them one by one, and they basically fall in line. Traditionally, senators are a little more independent, even of the president of the same party. So we still think there's a really good chance of either amending this bill significantly or killing it. And in the alternative, you know, frankly, it is an expression of the values and priorities of the party in charge. And if we lose legislatively, then it's going to be an issue in the midterms.
And I'm curious to know, when we think about Hawaii specifically, you know, we've talked to the governor about this, just how reliant we are, especially when it comes to the health services that are at risk here. What would this mean for our community if it passes as is?
If it passes as is, a lot of families individually will suffer, but you'd have to be worried about certain clinics and rural hospitals in particular, who also, their payer mix is substantially Medicaid. And if you lose, say, 20% of 50% of your payers, you may not be able to operate at all. The big systems will probably absorb the cut and just give less in the way of services. But the very small neighbor island healthcare operations may have to shut down completely. And so that's a really scary prospect.
So, I mean, what you're saying is whether you're on these services or not, whether you're a beneficiary, you also could be at risk.
Oh, that's absolutely right. It's a really important point. 14 million people out of, hundreds of millions across the country may seem like a small percentage, but basically if you blow a hole in the revenue plan for any clinic or hospital, that hospital may cease to exist. And even if you're private pay, if you're Kaiser or HMSA, if that hospital is not available to you, then you've lost health care too.
Let's talk about some of the proposed cuts in this bill that also affect social services. We're talking about Medicaid as well as SNAP benefits. We have heard local lawmakers talking about how they may counter this as well, knowing that this could also happen. How directly do you think this will impact Hawaii families, and what are some of the conversations that you might be having that the state could have to come back in now and help provide that support if this does happen?
So it's kind of up to them, right? I mean, these are federal obligations, these are federal laws, these are federal programs. There may be instances where the state is in a position to kind of step up to the plate and blunt the harm, but the state is not in a fiscal position to just like replace federal revenue. So I'm in touch with Josh and the legislative leaders. I know that they are contemplating a special session. They're monitoring the tourism numbers very carefully. and they're monitoring their own fiscal situation very carefully. So certainly the state can step up, but they're never going to be able to replace all of those lost dollars. On the other hand, the kind of good news of this is that none of these cuts have been enacted, and most of the harm that has come to Hawaii in terms of the stopping of federal funds has been really acute, really harmful, but not, you're not talking about half of the federal funding. You're talking about individual grants that have gotten either shut down or frozen. And so we're monitoring it very carefully. My team has a spreadsheet that we check every day to see, okay, did this grant get obligated? Did these contracts get let? Did the money, literally we're at the point where we watch whether the money has been moved from one account to the other, which honestly shouldn't normally be my job. But the extent of the freezing of federal funds has caused us to kind of dig in and make sure Hawaii continues to get its fair share.
It's interesting when you say that because it reminds me of a conversation that we had recently with Superintendent Keith Hayashi, who said that basically he has a team, they call themselves the Fed Watch. They meet every week, and they're trying to figure out where are the pukas and what are we missing. What are your concerns, outside of this, or definitely related to this, for things like education, for other areas? We've talked to people in the nonprofit community, and they are losing funding here and there, and it's adding up to be, very, very significant in terms of impact.
Yeah, on the nonprofit side, well, let me back up and say this. A lot of what Trump does is declare things to be true that are not yet true and get people kind of freaked out and operating as though these cuts have been enacted, including, eliminating the U.S. Department of Education or freezing funding. None of that has actually happened, and most of it has been reversed in federal court. So Superintendent Hayashi is wise to kind of monitor all of this and be ready for a worst case scenario, but it hasn't materialized. On the nonprofit side, federal grants to nonprofits often have a provision that basically gives total authority to the federal government to cancel a contract. And so it's a little harder to just sue because there's a provision that says the federal government may cancel, quote unquote, for convenience. And so a lot of those dollars are actually gone. And so we're working with our nonprofit partners, and I have a background in the nonprofit community, to try to make sure that they can absorb the blow, the charitable sector, state and county government, and then the next round of appropriations to try to make sure that they can navigate through this very, very difficult period. But on the one hand, cutting the Department of Education depends on us, and we're not going to do it. On the other hand, cutting some of these grants, it's happened, and it's very, very real.
I just want to follow up on that, because when you're looking at some of the statements that are being made, and going back to your point of what the president says often is he thinks it's true, but it's not the reality of what the process looks like. How are you navigating that? Because it seems like there's a statement every day that comes out from the White House. And how much of your time is spent on trying to educate people about this, about the process, and when do you actually categorize it as an actual threat?
When is it time to freak out?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I basically have to go through that every morning, right? Is it time to freak out? Now, the first principle here is if everything is an emergency, then nothing is an emergency. If I'm always with my hair on fire, then I've lost my credibility. The first thing I do is try to figure out what's actually true, because I think I take my obligation as a senator for Hawaii really seriously on federal funds in particular, which is to say, if I say something, I know people are relying upon that. And so if I'm not sure what's happening, that's what I tell folks right now. Usually I'm pretty sure what's happening, but in the Trump era, there's a lot of sifting between fact and fiction, trying to figure out what a court order means, figuring out what they actually mean versus what they're doing, and all the rest of it. So I have to do that sorting every day and then communicate with stakeholders. I try not to be totally freaked out on behalf of everybody at all times, because we all have to live our lives and function professionally. But on the other hand, this is a very alarming time, and we all have to pull together.
One of the things about that uncertainty and what you're describing is that, the individuals are reacting. And so we have a good friend, our family is a good friend who has a local business, and they manufacture in China. And because the tariffs were at one point 145%, they had to cancel what they were making in China. And now this business is in flux and is probably going out of business. It's a good friend. She's had this business for 5 years. They make local toys for local kids. That's basically the crux of the business. And so, now those tariffs have gone back down to, I think, around 30%, but she can't put her orders in because she doesn't know that tomorrow they go to 145%. And this is one small business, and this is happening to many, many business owners. So, how are you, advising folks to navigate this?
On the tariffs, I don't have good news, right? On the federal funding, I can help to give some context and some strategies and help on the back end to make sure either the money is flowing or that we get people back in the next appropriation cycle. On the tariffs thing, it is pretty much a presidential authority that, since a law was passed about 100 years ago, has been unchallenged. And so I don't have a lot of good news to tell a small business that imports their product, especially from China, because to your point, is it a 10% tariff? Is it 21? Is it 150%? It's very hard to make orders, and it's hard to respond if you're a consumer. Why would you buy something you're not sure if it's coming in 9 weeks or never or next week? And so it's very, very difficult, and I don't have a I don't want to have a pat answer for that, because this is the president's authority, and this is what's happening to all of us. And I do think over the next several weeks at Costco, Walmart, Target, we're going to see prices go up.
As someone who has been in office for some time, and actually in office when President Trump's during his first term, what do you see as the biggest differences this time around from that first 4 years while he was in office?
I feel like he always had that unpredictable aspect, right? He always had that improper aspect, but this feels like, people used to say you got normal Republican policies with some mean tweets. This is not normal Republican policies. The tariffs are just nonsense and pretty antithetical to what traditional Republicans used to believe. He's not an internationalist. He's violating the law at multiple levels, kind of in a flood the zone sort of strategy. So we're looking at a much more radical presidency and a kind of behavior of someone who, got through a bunch of attempts to, put him in jail, to sort of leave him in the political, dustbin of history after January 6th, and he's survived it all. And so I think he's got a little bit of swagger about what he wants to accomplish. And the one thing that he has always believed is that we are not charging enough on tariffs. This is a longstanding belief of his. He sort of flipped on most things, gay rights, choice, whatever. He was a Democrat. But the one thing that he's believed for decades and decades is that we're not charging enough in tariffs. So I think he's going to just go through with this thing until and unless the stock market and polling numbers tell him, hey, this isn't working. And even then, he feels, I think, a little bit more like he's not so concerned about normal metrics of popularity.
You talked about him being able to basically call the House members out one by one, and I mean, what it sounds like to me is bullying, honestly, when you describe that kind of a tactic. I don't know what that's called in politics, but
no, it's called bullying.
And perhaps less of ability to do that with your colleagues. What are the conversations behind the scenes? I mean, is everyone on board with this kind of behavior in his party, because he's getting things passed?
Look, I can't speak to House Republicans. I have a couple of relationships on the House Republican side, but my good, personal, professional friendships are on the Republican side or with senators, and they are, they're not uniformly worried. There are a bunch of people who are just kind of drank the Kool-Aid and they're all in for this stuff. But there are a bunch of people, conservative, moderate, whatever, who don't like what's happening and don't like what's happening on behalf of their constituents. It's, it's the FAA, it's the tariffs, it's the lack of internationalism. A lot of these people came of age and became Reagan Republicans because they wanted that robust foreign policy. So he's abandoned most of the things that caused these people to join the Republican Party in the first instance. And so the challenge, right, is where is your red line for these people? And they kind of continue to justify moving the line and talking in private and sending a note to the White House Chief of Staff. But at some point, you can't be a senator in private. You can't stand up to the president in private. You have to stand up and say, enough is enough. My constituents are more important to my party. Than my party.
You have, as we kind of alluded to, become a very vocal critic on social media. You've become known outside of Hawaii just for some of the pushback that you've given to the administration. I'm wondering what the message is like for those who do support the president and these policies. How do you communicate that with a demographic of people who see things very differently and believe that these are the right steps to be taking, and maybe see your comments and the things that you're saying online as something that's aggressive and don't agree with you at all?
Yeah, I think people get to not agree with me, and I think that what I owe everybody is my hard work and my focus on Hawaii. And so there are times, it's compromise where you can, fight when you must. And I think, because of the way the dial has been turned in the first 120 days, I'm doing a little more fighting than normal. But I still have the same basic approach, which is to try to reflect Hawaii's values. But maybe more essential to the job is to reflect Hawaii's priorities. I have a lot of people who like Trump or disagree with me on a social issue, whatever. And then they say, but your fundamental job is to try to secure resources for the state of Hawaii. So even despite the fact that I kind of want to yell at you about that thing you said on the internet, you're delivering, and so it's okay. I don't overestimate the impact of that because partisanship is a hell of a drug, but I do think there are a number of people who sort of are willing to say, it's fine that I disagree with him as long as he's working his butt off and has enough relationships to keep Hawaii's economy in decent shape.
I want to get back to a way that we're seeing the federal government in our community right now. It's the lead story of the Star Advertiser this morning. Few details released on more than 100 immigration arrests. So ICE is in our community. We have seen, especially on Hawaii Island, quite a few of these raids in agricultural settings and others. What is your feeling about what's happening when it comes to immigration enforcement in Hawaii right now?
It's terrible. And it's terrible in a very specific way. Hawaii... We're a place of immigrants. We're a place that respects whatever brought you here. Non-immigrant visa, tourist, EB-5, teacher, green card holder, citizen. There are lots of ways to find yourself in the state of Hawaii. And a lot of people feel pretty strongly about enforcing our existing immigration laws, and I respect that. But what we're seeing right now is not an attempt to enforce our existing immigration laws, but rather a kind of concerted effort to terrorize people, to make them afraid. There is a reason that so-called sensitive places, that's the term of art they use, have always been off limits. You don't go to a church or a synagogue or a temple. You don't go to a school or a hospital. You have to stay away from you can find people who are violating the law and conduct your law enforcement operations in a way that don't appear to be actually intending to terrorize people. The challenge that we have right now is that under normal circumstances, I can get the special agent in charge for the FBI, I can get Homeland Security investigations, I can get whomever is ICE on the phone. We have not had an easy time getting someone on the phone. And there's always been this sense, right, among law enforcement personnel, federal, state, county, in Hawaii, that we're all neighbors, right? And so it actually brackets the behavior. It makes sure people understand, like, hey, this could be my cousin or at least my coworker's, second cousin. And so, just be cognizant of the fact that we're all going to have to see each other at the Safeway, on Saturday. That is not the behavior of law enforcement recently. And you've had these combined operations, we think, between ICE and Homeland Security and others. But I at least think that Congress needs to be able to understand who's doing what and who they report to. So this week we're trying to get everybody on the phone to at least let them understand what the concerns are. And then the final thing I'd say is a lot of people are terrified. And so if you go to our website, it's schatz.senate.gov, we have a little fact sheet and some advice for anyone who's just afraid and wants to know what their rights are. Not actually trying to facilitate anyone evading the law, but you do need to understand what your rights are, what you're entitled to do, and how you can keep your family and your community safe.
Okay, we're going to take a short break. We'll be right back with the senator. Many more questions to ask, including some of yours. Stay with us. You're watching Spotlight Now.
From the moment you wake up.
Hawaii News Now brings you the stories that impact your day.
With more on the breaking news, we go live to Casey Lund.
Ready with the push alert? I'm going live. We have an update to the breaking news we brought you this morning on Sunrise.
Okay, guys, as soon as this wraps, toss to Mahia.
And we've been covering this story all day.
Now we go live to Mahia for a new development.
Stand by for breaking news. They just captured the suspect.
That's confirmed?
Yes, sources just confirmed it.
The news you need the moment it breaks.
Here on Hawaii News Now.
First alert traffic is like always having a helpful passenger right next to you.
There's a crash up ahead in the left lane.
When we see a backup, we'll tell you live on TV.
That doesn't look too good.
And send an alert to your phone.
I'll type, you drive.
First alert traffic on TV, streaming, and on the Hawaii News Now app.
Keeping you and your ohana safe.
Spotlight Now with Yunji Denise and Ryan Kalei Suchi. connecting you with newsmakers from throughout our islands, going in depth with Hawaii's leaders, and taking your questions live. Spotlight Now, where Hawaii comes to talk.
And welcome back to Spotlight Now. We're continuing on in our conversation with Senator Brian Schatz. And again, we want to encourage all of you watching to enter your questions and comments for the senator on Facebook.
And we want to continue in with our conversation, continuing on immigration, but in a different form. We have seen, in addition to the ICE activity here in our islands, also people being arrested or detained at the Federal Detention Center. These are tourists who are trying to get into the country, I'm not here to judge those individual cases, but there have been some high-profile detentions of what seem like tourists just making a mistake. What are your thoughts on that, and what do you think that kind of message sends to tourists who want to come here from international destinations?
It's a terrible message. It really is a terrible message. And we want all of our tourists to obviously enter Hawaii lawfully, but we also want them to understand that they are guests in a very, very special place, that this is, not their personal amusement park, and they have to respect culture and the environment. But we are, at our core, a welcoming community. And I mean, those two German tourists who I think were detained, at least temporarily, because they hadn't booked their hotel. And I was thinking, when I was 19 and I was going someplace, I don't know if I might have lost the paperwork. I mean, it's just a sort of standard backpacker thing to do, to not know exactly where you're going to stay. That is not illegal. And so to me, it goes to this broader sense that what they're trying to do is make people scared, but also that the White House wants to meet certain metrics, right? And so when they can't arrest or detain people for legitimate reasons, they have to get deeper and deeper into like what is, pretty inappropriate detention and legal enforcement. And so, look, it is inconsistent with our values, and it also hurts our economy. Right now, I think it's a blip on the screen, but if this is something that happens on a more systematic basis, it's going to hurt Hawaii. I'll also say that it's probably already hurting tourism on the continental United States side. People are kind of wary about visiting the mainland.
Let's talk about some of the other cuts that could be coming, or areas where Hawaii depends on federal funding, starting specifically with transportation and with the rail and its state. Is there any cause for concern based on what you're hearing about major projects like these that rely so heavily on federal dollars?
So far, so good. Only the paranoid survive in politics, so I will remain paranoid until the last dollar is transferred to whichever state, county, or local nonprofit is entitled to get those resources. But on the heart side, we're plugging along staff to staff. We're meeting our metrics. There are lots of reasons to be worried about rail and its completion and its operation, and maybe its extension all the way to the University of Hawaii, which I hope we undertake and take seriously in the future. But so far, so good. Everything is in the context of, but tomorrow morning everything could change, but I think so far so good.
Okay, let's talk about Lahaina. We know that is obviously very reliant on federal dollars as well. What is your feeling about where the recovery is up until this point, and how much we can rely on federal support there?
The grand total so far that Maui is entitled to and expecting to receive is about $2.6 billion. A lot of that is the Community Development Block Grant disaster recovery money. And they're, again, working very well with the HUD staff. They've submitted their action plan. They anticipate that it'll be approved. And so, again, I don't have any bad news to report, and that is good news. The other way to understand Lahaina's recovery, and I encourage people to go to not just Maui, but West Maui, and start to enjoy the restaurants, maybe do a staycation if you can, because we want that economy to start doing well again. But there are about 700 homes that are, either under construction or built and occupied. Remember that it was 2,200 structures that were destroyed, some of those commercial, but we're 700, against that 2,200, and about 400 building permits have been pulled. So if you add that all up, it's about half of rebuilding totally. And look, I don't want anyone to relax, because I think we had to work really hard and sound the alarm to get where we are. But, if you physically go to Lahaina now, it looks like a place that is in recovery. There are cranes, There are people in their fluorescent shirts. Like, work is happening. People are starting to occupy buildings. There's a little bit of hope again. And I think, money is essential, but it's probably, 1A. 1B is hope, right? And people are starting to feel like there's a future on Maui again, and there's a future in West Maui. We've got a long way to go. We're probably 30% of the way there towards a recovery, but 30% of the way there is still worth sort of commemorating.
One of the things that also became a result of what's happened in Maui, and then also a year later what happened with the wildfires in LA, is the insurance premiums and just the rising cost of that overall. We've had the governor on this program talking about how the state could address it. He's at some points noted that it has to be something at the federal level that needs to be done because of the amount of money that it's going to cost. What is your reaction to what's happening with some of these rising costs of insurance and how people are navigating that?
There's a really acute insurance crisis in Hawaii, and some of it has to do with climate risk, and some of it has to do with just old buildings and all of that. So to a certain extent, the state government can come in, as they did with the Hawaii Hurricane Relief Fund, and provide a backstop, sort of government-backed reinsurance to reduce the premiums. But we are looking at probably a global phenomenon of climate-induced catastrophes, and the Florida insurance market is basically collapsing as we speak. Whether that infects the sort of overall risk pool and means that in order to cover the losses in places like Louisiana, Florida, Alabama, that we're now in their risk pool and we're all getting it monthly, remains to be seen. But this is a really serious issue. The truth is the federal government is not likely to come in the short run and to be a backstop or a reinsurer. So whatever I can do to help the state government, I know Scott Psyche and Josh are working on that. But this one, I don't want to pretend there's an easy short-term solution. This is tough.
Yeah, and related to, we'll talk about climate in a minute, but related to that, of course, is also FEMA and the changes that the federal government is now making to that agency. We saw FEMA on the ground in Lahaina and how critical that resource was for our people when we had that major disaster. What are your concerns about what's happening to that agency?
So this is one where I would be pretty precise about what has been proposed versus what has been enacted. There was an executive order saying, like, we should get rid of FEMA. And then it sort of was met on the Hill with a kind of because we're not getting rid of FEMA. Republicans aren't getting rid of FEMA. Democrats aren't getting rid of FEMA. There's no political appetite for getting rid of the federal agency that is on the ground when you get hit by a wildfire or a tornado or a flood or a hurricane or whatever it may be. And so FEMA was great on the ground for the people of Maui. But FEMA is sort of universally appreciated on both sides of the aisle. I'm not very worried about FEMA being shut down. I am worried about a government shutdown or a reduction in funding, but I think there are a couple of agencies that enjoy really strong bipartisan support, and FEMA is one of them.
As we talk about some of these issues that happen and these occurrences that are related to what many believe is climate change, you have become a vocal leader in this industry and for this cause. Hawaii has set some lofty goals, but with some of the change in what's coming out of the White House, how does that impact Hawaii's future and some of the goals that have been set? And do you think that creates any limitations or barriers moving forward?
So the federal tax credits are very helpful nationally to drive our clean energy adoption, and they worked. And it's true that the House bill basically gets rid of those tax credits. I have a bunch of Republican friends on the Senate side who are at least telling me reassuring things that they're going to get rid of the part of this bill that eliminates the federal tax credits. Now, whether that sticks, whether when Donald Trump calls and says, do it anyway, whether they end up, standing strong or not, I just don't know. But I will say that, we're still on track, and Hawaii was still on track before the enactment of the Inflation Reduction Act to reach our clean energy goals, because the math kind of works in Hawaii regardless of the tax credit structure. And the reason is because the stupidest and most expensive thing to do for electricity is to bring a bunch of oil in on a tanker from across an ocean and then light it on fire for electrons. Like, that is what we did 50 years ago, and there's a reason most people are not generating their electrons that way. So stuff still pencils out in Hawaii even without a generous tax credit regime. I think the more challenging part in Hawaii is we're a bunch of islands, and we want to integrate a bunch of intermittent energy into the grid, so we need battery storage and smart grid technology to kind of make it work. And then we need to be more, open-minded, caring, big picture about citing these things, right? If everybody's truly committed to a 100% clean energy future, you are not allowed to, in your mind's eye, imagine that we're going to generate all the clean energy that we need, and you personally will never see any of it. You're going to see solar farms, you might see more geothermal, you're going to see wind turbines, and it's an aesthetic trade-off. I'm not pretending it's not. But if we care about the planet and if we care about our own ecosystems, then to generate clean energy, we're going to have to see clean energy, and it's not going to be all in someone else's neighborhood. It's got to be all around the state of Hawaii.
It's interesting. I'm reading the comments here, and there's a mixture of complaints and compliments. And so I'm curious to know.
Story of my life.
Well, I am curious to know what your constituents are calling you about, because when we've been working together for a long time. We've interviewed a number of times during COVID. People were very concerned about their health, of course, the economy. But what are the calls you get now?
The main calls on the kind of policy side are in opposition to the Medicaid cuts. And the main calls on the constituent service side. So some people call us to tell us, don't vote for this, or do vote for that, or good job, or you're terrible, or whatever. And we just take that under advisement, and then my staff kind of compiles it and gives it to me. So I'm getting the feedback directly. On the other side, some people need help with stuff. And this goes to sort of Trump's power to make people believe something has already happened, even if it's just been declared. We are getting an increasing number of calls from people who are kind of panicked about the availability of Social Security and Medicare in particular. And so we have to tell them Social Security still exists. It's the same program. Nothing has changed. Medicare likewise. So we just kind of walk them through the fact that their Social Security benefits remain intact. Could that change in the future? Sure. But even this administration is not really proposing a reduction in benefits. They're making it harder to get through on the phone, but that's different from a reduction in benefits.
A week ago on this program, State Senator Brenton Awa announced that he is looking into a run for congressional district to be challenge Congresswoman Jill Takuda in that district. I wanted to get your thoughts. One of the things that he advocated for on this was that because the Democrats are now the minority, having a Republican serve in this delegation would be a benefit to the state of Hawaii. Your thoughts about challengers from the Republican Party and specifically Senator Awa maybe entering this race?
Well, I like Jill. I'm going to be supporting Jill. She's a great colleague. She's relatively new to the United States Congress. And I just remember one of the first things she did first couple of months actually was have a bipartisan meeting with the ranking member of the Agriculture Committee and introduced a bunch of Hawaii agricultural companies to them. And it was just very well run and very focused on the 2nd Congressional District. So she's a person who does the work, who pays attention to the community, and that's why I'm going to be supporting her. I will say anybody gets to run for anything. No one's entitled to a seat. As my old friend Neil Abercrombie used to say, they have screws that you can unscrew and slide your name right off the door. It's not nailed in. It's not bolted in. It just comes out with, 4 drills and then someone else. So it is not my office. It is not Jill's office. It's the people's office. But I do think the people are going to find that Jill's doing a good job.
How is it for you to govern in this time? I mean, what is it like for you? I would, you're coming in here. What I really appreciate what you're saying. One of the things is that just because it's said doesn't mean it's happened. And so I'm getting a lot of reassurance from you, and I'm sure a lot of people look to you for that. But I mean, you're gearing for a fight basically every single day.
Yeah, it is. I have to sort of stay clear-headed in that particular way because you also don't want to be taking bait and going down rabbit holes and being confusing to people or causing unnecessary alarm. But this is a very serious time, both in terms of the fiscal condition of state and county government, our overall economy, but the bones of democracy. It's not the thing I lead with, but it matters very much to me that we are still a country that abides by the rule of law. Whoever is in charge of the government has to abide by the rule of law. And so, I try to stay grounded in all of that. But the most important thing to stay grounded in is like, what are my actual neighbors and friends and people that I work with and care about? And they are not waking up every day thinking about Article 1 of the Constitution, Article 2. They're thinking about, oh my God, I just went to Costco, and do you know how much more? I mean, I got a text saying Laogam Ma is now $3 more per bottle, and it's kind of a fun example, but it's a very real example of like politics is not an abstraction for most people. politics is now hurting their pocketbook and making them feel less safe. And so my job is to try to, blunt the impact of politics, make their pocketbook just a little more full, and to make them feel a little bit reassured. But the way to be reassuring is not to tell them a story that everything's perfect and going to be fine and don't worry, but to be as blunt as I can about where we really are.
How important are the midterms next year, and where do you think the Democratic Party is at right now? There have been some criticism by members of the party about the way things were managed in the last election, and as a vocal leader now in the Senate, your thoughts overall on heading into the midterms and the state of the Democratic Party as a whole?
On the midterms, I think the House is likely to flip. That's just sort of an actuarial fact. Whoever is in the minority party, in a midterm of a president, you usually have the public saying, hey, it'd be good if we got a little balance here. The Senate picture is a little more challenging just because of the specific members who are up for re-election and not. But we think we can pick up seats there. But I just think generally the Democratic Party has not painted a picture of what we want for the future. There was a lot of protecting what we care about and a lot of protecting people and programs and institutions and governments, but we ended up sounding a little bit like nanny state nags and explainers and talking down to folks. And I think that was one of the problems, is at least Donald Trump looked like he was having fun. At least Donald Trump looked like he was on the side of the future and freedom. And even if it was not true, or even if it was a scary future, at least it was looking forward towards the future, as opposed to this kind of like, we're going to protect you. We're going to protect all the organizations. Everything is already perfect, and you should just vote for us to continue the status quo. We cannot be the status quo party anymore. And the fact that we're in the minority now and lost both the House and the Senate and the presidency, gives us a credible case to be the party of change.
We know that your time is limited, and unfortunately we're almost out of time, but I want to get to some fun lightning round questions because we always like to get a little flavor of what you're up to while you're here.
Yeah, we'd like to get to know, I guess, on a different level, I guess. So we're going to just ask these questions. First answer that comes to mind, not a lot of thinking. We don't need long responses here. But your favorite beach on Oahu?
Oh, Point Panic, if that's a beach.
Yeah, okay, that counts. When you are heading into these long sessions on the Senate floor, what is your go-to caffeine source?
Oh, just black coffee.
If there were a talent show to be held at the Senate, what would be your talent?
Oh, yeah, body surfing.
Okay, body surfing
I like
through
that
the
one.
House of Congress. Any binge shows that you're binge watching currently, or an addiction of a television show that you like to watch?
I know I'm a little late, but I'm halfway through the most recent season of The Last of Us.
Oh, okay. Yeah, great.
Very nice. And we'll just ask you for a final message to folks who are watching. I did mention that you're giving folks a lot of reassurance today with this conversation. But what do you want people to know about what's happening in Washington?
Just don't have the threshold to be contacting our office to be too high. If you have a question, contact our office, schatz.senate.gov. And there is a form, but it's not a black hole. It goes to a specific human being in a cubicle who gets it as an email. So if you got something you want to tell us or ask us, go to schatz.senate.gov.
Okay, Senator, thank you so much for being here with us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks both.
We'll be back with Carl Bonham right after this. You're watching Spotlight Now. Stay with us.
Hello and welcome back to Spotlight Now. We're going to continue on in our conversation here this afternoon with our next guest.
And Carl Bonham is here, economist, of course, from UHERO. Carl, thanks for being here. We heard the senator just talking now, saying that, he's seeing prices go up at Costco and everywhere else. What are you seeing?
Well, we're just beginning to see the price increases, right? I mean, we'll get data for April this week, and really it's going to be May and June before you see a lot of the impacts of tariff, and that'll drag on throughout the rest of the year. And I mean, in our forecast, by the end of the year, we have inflation roughly 2 to 2.5% higher than it would have been without the tariffs. So if we would have had 2% inflation, we're going to see 4.5% inflation, and that's true nationally and in Hawaii as well.
Can you talk a little bit about the forecast that came out that looks to be that Hawaii is heading towards a recession, some of the factors that have gone into that projection and prediction?
Sure. Yeah. The headline is basically we're headed for a mild recession. And, even if we don't end up having a recession, it's still going to feel like we're having a recession. In other words, the economy is going to grow more slowly, and unfortunately prices are going to rise, so people are going to be squeezed. And the thing that went into that is mostly, sort of self-imposed policies coming out of Washington, D.C. The thing that makes Hawaii go into recession, whereas the nation as a whole doesn't, is just that we were growing more slowly before this. Both economies were doing really quite well with strong job growth before January. And actually, Hawaii had very good job growth in the first 4 months of this year. But then when you pile on higher costs for everybody in the country, harder to get a job, stock market volatility, all of the uncertainty around tariffs, weaker U.S. economy, Canada and Japan probably going into recession, and then you have lost visitor spending because of that, it drives job losses on top of losses from the federal budget and from federal civilian losses. So we're looking at more than 2,000 federal civilian jobs that will be shed over the next year because of the cuts in Washington, and another 3,000 or so state jobs that are at risk because they're paid for by federal funds. And then, and this is really before we had solid information about how detrimental the House bill would be on the budget that adds additional cuts in healthcare that Senator was speaking about. So all that combines to mean job losses. So after about 1% job growth this year, by the time you get to the end of the year, we'll be losing jobs, and we think we'll lose almost 1% of the job count next year.
Those are a lot of pretty grim factors, and when you put them all together, it does paint a pretty grim picture. I'm curious to know, when you say mild recession, do we have a time frame for that? How long you expect that to last, and what gets us out of it? I know you're not a fortune teller, so you can't predict the future, but
yeah, and we're going to be wrong. I mean, just flat out, we're going to get it wrong. I think we have the flavor. If the story you're telling subjectively, if you get that right, that's 99% of the battle when it comes to forecasting. The actual dates of when things happen, we'll get those wrong. But basically, we think we'll start losing jobs in the second half of this year. So coming June, July, August, we'll start to see some job losses. That might be postponed a little bit because the start of the year was very, very strong. And basically, it's something that lasts 6 months to a year, where a year from now, we'll probably have fewer filled jobs in Hawaii than we have right now.
One of the biggest factors that are often played into these projections and predictions is where we at with our visitor arrivals and just the overall tourism industry as a whole. Based on what you're seeing, spending as well as arrivals, what are some of the things that indicates the growth overall with the economy?
So I'm glad you brought up visitor spending, because actually the first quarter of this year, real visitor spending was the strongest it's been in several years. I think we saw over 5% growth in real visitor spending in the first quarter, and a fair amount of that is still, it's still recovery on Maui. Maui is still in that process. Visitor arrivals were basically flat, and if you look at I think we're going to see some strong numbers when we get the visitor data for April. That'll come out this week. May, June, July, those all look to be flat to down. And if you look at the airline seats coming in from Japan, Canada, the rest of the world, the U.S., they're sharply down on the international flights. And you talked a little bit with the senator about the risks for international visitors traveling to the U.S. and what their perceptions are, what gets reported in the news. So we're hearing a lot about Canadian visitors specifically boycotting the United States. We don't have hard data on that yet for Hawaii, but you're seeing it in the international statistics that show that Canadians are not flying, they're not traveling to the U.S. like they used to. So we actually used that information when we formed our forecast. So it's a combination of the economics, right? So Canada and Japan are at pretty serious risk because of the tariff wars, and attitudes towards travel, right? And with Canada, it's anger over, the threatened takeover, and with Japan, they're going to react to these detentions and other risks, and all of those are unhappy statistics for certainly international visitors.
We focus a lot on the Japanese market, but how important is the Canadian market to the Hawaii economy?
So when Canada would be third, and they they're roughly the same size as Japan, depending on which metric you look at. They're really important for Maui, and we saw a pretty sharp drop in Canadian visitors to Maui post wildfire. And then next, they're most important on Oahu. But Japan is, of course, much more important on Oahu. Then when you get to the Big Island and Kauai, that's primarily a U.S. visitor market.
In the first few months of the Trump presidency, one of the things that we also saw was just a lot of positions being eliminated for federal workers, jobs, entire agencies and entities being downsized. How much of that has impacted us locally and the overall job market here with our numbers that we're seeing?
So far, very little, right? I mean, actually, I've said a few times that Hawaii was doing really well in the first part of this year, and if actually the April job numbers, Hawaii had the fastest job growth in the country in April. So that was very positive. I'm certainly not clear why, but basically every sector outside of the federal government added jobs through the first 4 months of this year, and the federal government job losses were quite small. They weren't really what we're expecting from ongoing job cuts that have been announced, right? And the senator spoke to the fact that you have to distinguish between the announcement and what actually happens, because so many of the announcements are just, okay, we're going to cut, and then it gets held up in court. And so we're really taking, so there were the original sets of announcements of cuts that were largely coming out of DOGE, and then all the agencies, all the departments were told, okay, now plan for reductions in force. Now, reductions in force are a legal way for them to downsize. And so what we did was we really used those announcements of what the planned reductions in force were by department, and estimated that in Hawaii we'd lose roughly 2,700 federal civilian jobs. But that's just the federal civilian, right? That's not the job losses at the nonprofits or potential job losses at the state and local level, because when state and local government loses funding, when they lose federal funding, they tend to cut back on employment as well.
So when we've talked to lawmakers about this, one of the things they've said is special session, and that they're going to try to shore up some of these federal cuts by spending more state dollars. How much, we cannot possibly make up for all the federal losses. How are lawmakers going to be able to navigate this?
We cannot make up for all, if we lost all of our federal funding to the state government, to the county governments, to nonprofits, we could not fill that hole. But I don't think anybody expects that, right? And certainly our delegation will be fighting to make sure that doesn't happen to the best of their ability. But we came into this self-made crisis in a good place with, I believe the special fund had $1.5 billion in it. And then the ledge set aside a couple $100 million to deal with sort of contingencies in the special session. Right, the possibility we lose SNAP benefits, for example, or we have to fund half of the SNAP benefits, or however it works out. And then there was the recent settlement that all goes into the special fund, and I think that comes to close to $500 million will go into the special fund. So there's a lot of money there, and the purpose of that is, I keep calling it a special fund. It's the rainy day fund. The purpose of that is for when the rainstorm hits, and it's at least sprinkling, and it may start pouring, and we'll find out more as they work through the budget bill.
I just want to get your assessment. How do you think things went for lawmakers this past legislative session, given a lot of uncertainty? Your thoughts overall, just examining what's happened. I know you pay close attention to that. How do you think things panned out as a whole?
I would, I'm not you'd have to ask Colin Moore, my colleague. I'm not doing the political analysis. From a overall, economy standpoint, I think we did just fine. I couldn't point to any bills that passed that I think are doing great damage, great harm. I would give it at least a B+ if I were going to grade it. We've certainly seen more difficult sessions, and but a lot will be determined by what happens in Washington over the next month or two.
When you're telling people how to navigate this, because you did say that we're expecting I think a mild recession is what you called it, right?
Yeah.
The senator saying prices are going up. As people, maybe they make the same amount of money, but they're worried about the prices going up. And how are you advising people to navigate this kind of economic uncertainty? Because if I don't go out to eat, then I make it worse to the restaurant, and so on and so on.
Yeah, so I tend not to give personal financial advice, right? But I do talk with business people, nonprofits, unions, and talk about what they're facing, and mostly what they're facing is uncertainty, and so what that means is that you have to be really careful with the big purchases, the big ticket things, and whether you're overextended, because you're by far, for most of us, the biggest risk is if you were to lose your job in terms of your financial stability. And everybody's position is different, right? If you've been a school teacher for the last decade, 99.9% chance you aren't losing your job. And so for you, it's really about prices going up. And that means you end up tightening in places that are necessities, and that are more luxuries, and maintaining those necessities. And that's kind of the way the state government's going to have to behave as well, right? When they go into this special session, it's going to be about protecting the stuff that we stand for, right? Protecting the vulnerable, protecting the people who are going to lose their Medicaid and their SNAP benefits because of this administration.
Just quickly, we don't have much time, but I just was wondering, as we look at tourism as potentially softening, is there any other industry that could help to carry something, maybe a boom in construction, or is there anything else that we could see money coming in a different industry?
So for the last several years, and certainly during post-Maui wildfire, it's really been the construction industry that has completely offset the loss. I mean, we lost roughly $1 billion in real visitor spending in 2024 compared to 2023 post-wildfire. And construction completely made up for that. Now, that was mostly federal money. The vast majority of that was federal money. So at least in our forecast, construction is probably peaking as those projects have reached their peak, and you're not going to see big growth there. There's some possibility. The state, has been talking about a stadium. It's not all that common for the state to spend large amounts of construction money when they're looking at lost tax revenues like the Council on Revenue's forecast. So there's a possibility the state could bolster that, but it's not likely enough to offset what our forecast for almost $1.5 billion loss in visitor spending.
Wow. Okay, Carl Bonham, we always learn so much when you're here. Mild recession, and we'll have you back to talk about that when we get into perhaps a special session.
Let's hope I'm wrong.
Spotlight Now continues right after this. Stay with us.
From the moment you wake up.
Hawaii News Now brings you the stories that impact your day.
With more on the breaking news, we go live to Casey Lund.
Ready with the push alert? I'm going live.
We have an update to the breaking news we brought you this morning on Sunrise.
Okay, guys, as soon as this wraps, toss to Mahia.
And we've been covering this story all day.
Now we go live to Mahia for a new development.
Stand by for breaking news. They just captured the suspect.
That's confirmed?
Yes, sources just confirmed it.
The news you need the moment it breaks.
Here on Hawaii News Now.
Spotlight Now with Yunji Denise and Wright Kalei Suji. Connecting you with newsmakers from throughout our islands. Going in depth with Hawaii's leaders. And taking your questions live. Spotlight Now, where Hawaii comes to talk.
Well, a great conversation today with Senator Schatz, as well as from you here with Carl Bonham. We heard from Senator Schatz about some of the pressures that he's facing and trying to navigate through.
Yeah, and one thing that he kept coming back to is there's what the president says and what is actually possible. A lot of things are being stopped in the courts and being stopped by Congress. You heard the senator saying there that they are hoping actually to kill the tax bill. That would be a pretty big feat. I would be very surprised. But, you know, you never know.
Yeah, that's right. Well, if you want to catch the interview, make sure you head over to Hawaii News Now for the full interview. And we'll see you right back here next week where we talk to Governor Josh